thanks everyone for joining us today. It's really nice to see so many of you. And this is really a follow-up in many ways to the first talk I did a few months back now, just before Christmas, when I introduced this theme of what I call mapping the way to educational equity. And just to recap on that, the idea there was to talk about what is it we need if we want to shape an education system that secures greater equity. What do we need to get there? And I set out a number of ideas in that, which I think are really important if we want to achieve that. The first one being the fact that we need good information. We need the information to find our way on this difficult and challenging journey. The second one, it will be around sharing information, the fact that we can't just have information in one individual's head. It needs to be shared around the system so that we can all work together. And the third one was around the need to navigate a whole series of different obstacles on the way to equity. And today's session is about the first of those themes, so about what information it is we need. And we're going to be looking at that today from a point of view of policymakers, because one of the points I made when I last spoke to you was that actually what we need at a system level for policymakers is slightly different to what we might need at the granular level of a teacher and the practitioner. So we want to examine this question from those different perspectives. And today is that sort of zoomed out bird's eye view of the policymaker. And what I'm going to be talking about is 4 themes that came out in a discussion we held a few weeks back with a really impressive and interesting set of policymakers here in Cambridge. So we had England's Children's Commissioner, we had an advisor to the Secretary of State for Education, we had senior civil servants, and we had some leading academics who all came together to grapple with this question. And it was a really, really powerful discussion, which I've tried to distill into 4 themes to talk to you about today. And so what's going to happen is that I'm going to talk to you about the first of those, which is about needing to understand what's going on for all young people across the full distribution and full variation of young people's needs and achievements. The second one being about understanding to what extent we're meeting their basic needs. The third one being about needing to understand not just what they're achieving, but also what opportunities are available to them. And the fourth one being the need to balance simplicity with nuance. So we're going to look at the first 2 themes first, and then we'll take a little break to have some breakout rooms and compare experiences, because you're all coming from completely different contexts from around the world, and we want to be able to draw on that to share some of the amazing things that might be going on where you are, as well as the challenges. So then we'll take that pause, have that discussion, and then I will move on to the third and fourth themes. So let me go on now to that first theme. So this theme is around understanding the full distribution. So let me explain that. What we tend to have is a system in many different jurisdictions, but particularly in England, where we tend to look a lot at what's going on at the average. So how well are young people achieving on average, or perhaps to what extent are they meeting different thresholds of achievement? But what we don't see so much is what's going on above or below those thresholds and outside of the average. And my argument is that what we need to be doing is making sure that policymakers have information about what's going on across the whole distribution. And let me just illustrate that with an example, which is that when I was teaching, I remember one pupil who I'll call Brandon, who I had a feeling I could see that he was not likely to make it through to his GCSEs. So I decided to help him to take a GCSE early. And when he got his results, he looked at me and he looked at his result and said, "So does this mean I failed?" And the reason was because he'd got an E grade, which at the time was below the threshold of a good pass, which is a C. And for him, that meant he thought he'd failed, because we often talk about anything below a C, which has now become a good pass or a strong pass at a higher level. Anything below that we see as a fail. And it's almost like then it's a grade. So there's almost like there's no difference between getting a D, an E, an F, or a U, or a grade 1, 2, or 3. We don't see those necessarily as being useful pieces of information, and yet they're still telling us something about what's going on for those young people. So we've got this borderline and this sort of cliff edge. And my argument is that we need better information if we're to understand equity in education, what's going across the whole distribution. Because actually, those grades below that threshold are level 1 qualifications. and yet we see them as fails. And if you compare that to what goes on at the top of a distribution, we do pay attention to, for example, A's or A stars in old currency, or 9s and 8s in our new system, and I'm sure there'll be similar systems where you are. So somehow we do pay a bit of attention to what goes on at the fine grain of the top of a distribution, but less so at the bottom. And that's an even bigger issue when you take young people with special educational needs in some cases, because in many cases, those young people might not achieve one of these qualifications. And yet they could still be, we still need to know how they're progressing, because how can the system support them if we don't know how they're achieving? So that's my first theme, is that we need to be able to picture that whole distribution. And you can imagine that curve of a distribution and thinking about what's going on at every point in it. The second point is one that will be familiar to all of you who work with young people, which is that young people find it far easier to learn when their basic needs are met. And we therefore need information about their context, but sometimes that's lacking. And sometimes that could be information from young people's voice themselves, sometimes it might be from families. But with this, if we understand better whether or not their basic needs are being met, we can have a better understanding of whether they're set up and ready to learn. And that can also help us to identify good practice. So where are social services or youth services and the local authorities in England helping young people to be ready to learn? We need to be able to understand that in order to explain the success or failure of pupils in our education system. Because sometimes we interpret what the results from education as being a pure consequence of schools, but actually we need to understand all the other factors that are leading into that. A great example of that is something like attendance data, school attendance data, because being at school is generally a prerequisite for learning, and that is where we're supporting young people. And yet we don't even, in England, always have very good information about attendance. So one of the attendees at our roundtable the other day talked about how that information is often very late. We only get it 12 months late. It's sometimes very inaccurate information. It's not always complete. And this is becoming a real priority as lots of young people seem to be dropping off from the education system after the pandemic. So the government is currently in the UK focusing very much on trying to get better information on this. And that's got to be a real priority, because if a young person isn't attending school, that can often also be an indicator that something's going wrong and something needs to be addressed there. And when we don't have that information, things can go wrong. And we saw that in the early stages of the pandemic, when a lot of information about, for example, young people's access to devices was incomplete or inaccurate, and therefore government made decisions which were ill-informed and didn't tackle the issues because the information they were dealing with wasn't right. Similarly, it was only in the later stages of the pandemic that government started to realise just how much of an issue it was when young people didn't have a space at home in which to learn. So information on these sorts of things are a key part of being able to navigate the way to an equitable future for education, given how much of a determinant of education they are. So we need to start looking at some of the other sources of information that can be drawn on. And there are some really interesting developments in this space. So in England, we now have thousands of teachers every day using the Teacher Tap app to report what's going on in their schools. And that information from that became incredibly important during the pandemic, because it was almost an instant thermometer of what was going on that could be used by policymakers to make rapid decisions to try and tackle some of the issues that were standing in the way of young people's learning. So we need to have that about other blind spots too, things like poverty. We need to be drawing that information together to get a rounded picture of what's going on for young people and what might be standing in their way. And what we're going to be doing in our next roundtable is starting to look at how we can join that information up and link it together to get a full picture. So I've introduced to you there the first and second of the themes I want to talk about today, the distribution question and the basic needs question. And now we're going to spend a little bit of time in some breakout rooms where I want to give you an opportunity to share some examples from your own contexts of what kind of information is being used to understand what's going on across the whole distribution and to understand basic needs. So this is an opportunity for you to share some examples that we can then draw together and understand how different places are tackling this.
Yeah, I will open the breakout rooms now.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We had some interesting discussions in our room. We talked about a few issues around online access. We talked about how one person had kind of adapted their work based on how much connectivity there was. We talked about the use of patterns in Progress 8, for example, and the role of understanding kind of where young people were at when they started, so starting points. And we talked about how the role of awarding bodies in looking at the full distribution and setting grade boundaries. So that being one place where there is a lot of attention paid to the full distribution. And finally, some questions around sort of geography. And for example, access to internet in rural areas versus urban areas, and how at some points policymakers didn't really have access to that information and weren't acting on it, and that standing as a big barrier to young people's learning. So yeah, it was really useful to hear those points from people. I'll pass over to another room facilitator.
I can jump in there, Loic. I had room 4, and first, must I just say how happy I am. It was such a rich discussion. Really, really happy to get lots of different ideas on board. That was amazing. Thank you. Um, a little bit of an enlightenment moment for me, I suppose. I've been concerned about where this data is coming from. We talk about the sort of, yes, we've got the attendance data and this very sort of like black and white data, but what about the other information? The one that really, I think, came up strongest is maybe the mental health of the children, and how they're not necessarily going to be on a register, or that's not necessarily going to be in a certain place, but that information is held maybe other places, but that the onus isn't just on the teachers. And to me, that's always been a concern of mine, as we know that teachers are already time poor. So here's yet another incredibly important thing for them to do. But listening to parental survey data, and also empowering children themselves to have that information and ownership about their own mental health, which I think since COVID has been highlighted and might be something that we really grab onto into the future in education, and just make that even more important. There was a towards the end there, maybe a comment about children not feeling heard. We really do try and give them a platform, but are they being listened to, and does their voice carry on to the policy level as well? So that was group 4.
That's an interesting link to so one of the people who attended our roundtable was, as I say, the Children's Commissioner Dame Rachel D'Souza, who talked to us about the big when she came into the role, which asked over 500,000 young people about their experiences, including their mental well-being and so on, and that has since become a guiding force in the work that she's doing at a policy level in the Department for Education. So that turned out to be an incredibly powerful piece of information about that came from a different space. Okay, thank you.
Shall I come in next, Loic?
Sure, yeah, great.
Fantastic. So first of all, apologies to Adrian in our group, who was mid-flow and then the automatic room, door closed and moved us. But he was making a really interesting point about the offender learning context, and the sort of data that's really helpful there in terms of, working out, what outcomes you can achieve. So things like demographic data are really important because of the diversity of that learner base. And we also had a conversation which was more about the perils and the risks of using big data actually in terms of policy making. So we talked about the local authority sort of academy context, and what that data can tell us, but also what it might conceal, about the particular conditions in which that data, the outcomes were kind of delivered in. And also Doreen brought in a really interesting example from an international context from Uganda, just thinking through the comparison between local outcomes in terms of data and international ones through a Cambridge school of about 15 learners, and how it can be quite difficult to make those kind of comparisons, owing to the very different context in which that data is gathered.
Thank you.
I can just join now to give a little bit of an update on our room and what we discussed. So we actually looked at some of the kind of different demographics in terms of equity in education. So thinking about groups outside of young people, actually looking at perhaps people who are studying for vocational qualifications. In the case of Johanna, she was talking about some medical students and the kind of barriers that they might be coming up against, and looking at they're assembling quite a lot of data in terms of the kind of the BME background, the geographical location of where people are based. So that was really interesting and something to kind of factor in, because we talked about how there are kind of systemic issues that aren't just focused on young people, but kind of looking at people from other kind of walks of life and age ranges too. And Alice made a really interesting point also about how the potential of there being within assessments, areas that might kind of trigger certain issues for some people. So for example, we looked at money. If money came up within an exam, would that be something that kind of promoted a real worry and anxiety for some young people, and whether that was potentially an area that would then impact on their performance.
Thank you.
And also apologies to Tim, because he tried to say something at the end and we got thrown out of the room.
Always need more time, right? Always
Yeah.
need more time.
I can just report back from my, sorry, I wasn't really involved in the conversation because I was kind of trying to keep moving people into rooms. But from what I picked up in the discussion in our room was a lot around, sort of about the process of collecting data and who would be doing that, and also perhaps a breakdown, if there's a breakdown of trust between families and government agencies that might be wanting to collect data, as well as schools potentially not wanting to share data because perhaps in certain circumstances it's been used for purposes that maybe weren't clear from the beginning. So thinking about how we make it clear what the data is being collected for in the first instance, and how we sort of protect that trust between the different
Great,
sort of subjects of the data and agencies that it's shared with.
Cool.
I can launch the poll now if you want.
Yes. So just to gather, if you could do that, just to gather up and summarise our views here, I've just got a quick poll for you. I want to ask you, based on what we've said, I've talked about, what kind of data we don't have or we might need. So does that mean, my question to you is, do we need more data, or do we not need more data? We just need better quality data, or do we need a combination of the two? So a quick poll on that to gather based on where you are, what you think the key issue for you is. Oh gosh, strong majority there in terms of more and better. Quality's going up here. Second option's going up fast. But very few people think we need more data. That's interesting. Well, purely more data.
To add to that, Loic, actually, just on this topic, something that came up at the very end of our discussion was, it was Johanna who's talking about the medical students. She was saying that really the issue is making sense of the data. They've pulled a lot of data together, but it's kind of how do we make sense of it? Yeah,
good. And actually, that will link to my fourth theme that I'm gonna talk about quite nicely. So let me go on. Good. Okay, so thank you so much for all your input on that. That's great. We're going to have a bit more Q&A time as well at the end, so we can carry on the discussion, because it's fabulous to hear those views. So I'll skim through now my third and fourth themes. So the third theme is one I think quite interesting, because it sits slightly outside of education, but it kept coming up in our discussion at this round table, which was about the fact that education systems gather a lot of information about educational achievements, but less about the opportunities that young people have. And you might say, well, that makes sense, because an education policymaker is going to look at education data. But the issue is that we know that the opportunities young people know that they've got coming towards them have a strong washback effect on the way they engage in education. And a way to think about this is one of the theories for explaining the link between educational achievement and socioeconomic background is that pupils and their families are rational actors, that they're looking at what they think the likely payoff of their education is going to be, and that therefore, when they're engaging with education, they're taking into account what opportunities there will be. And this was illustrated during a roundtable using some information that was put together by the Social Mobility Commission. And what they found was that if you looked at young people from very disadvantaged backgrounds in Fenland, so near Cambridge here, and compared young people who achieved against the odds in this area, and then you looked at similar young people who did that in the northeast, there were very different opportunities available to those young people in Finland, because there's a lot of professional jobs that require academic qualifications, which there aren't in the Northeast. And that therefore it made a difference to young people's willingness to engage. And one person put it like this, a head teacher and a deputy head in the Northeast, they said that the young people they worked with didn't buy into the transaction between educational achievement and future opportunity, and that made it harder to support them to achieve. And we've talked also about how a lot of the high-profile charter schools in the United States really made a big show of the everyone going to college, and the transaction was about buying your way into college in the future. But how that doesn't necessarily always translate very well into a UK context because of what someone called bottlenecks of opportunity. And you can see why that happens, because things like supply of opportunity, certainly in England, are looked at by different departments to the Department for Education. And therefore, education policymakers don't always see it as their job to look at that information. But if we want to understand what doors education is opening for young people, then we need to understand both sides of that equation. So my argument here is that the labour market information is also relevant to education policymakers and needs to be used. So that's theme number 3. And finally, the fourth theme is about the balance between simplicity and nuance. Because as came up actually in the breakout room I was in, education information shapes behaviours. It's not neutral. And sometimes we want to have simple information. We want to be able to give people a headline piece of data that everyone can understand. But by doing so, we obscure the nuance and therefore cause people to act in different ways. And people are sometimes blind to that at a policy level. So I remember once sending a document to an official in the Department for Education, and I'd referred in my document to the headline school league table measures. And they sent it back to me and said, we don't publish headline school league table measures. We don't do league tables. There's no such thing. And I refused to take that out because I think that was naive. Now, the government doesn't necessarily call it a league table, but we know that as soon as data is published, it will be used in certain ways. So geeks like me will take a spreadsheet and sort it according to different categories. The media will construct league tables. Teachers and parents will decide which schools they want to send their children to or which schools they want to work in. So, and we know that there's also all these perverse incentives around gaming exams, narrowing the curriculums, and so on. So information always has these consequences. And although we might want simplicity, sometimes that's not the best in terms of shaping behavior. One person at the round table the other day said that post-16 data was great because it was so complicated that no one understood it. And therefore, schools were able to tell the story behind it and explain it in a way that wasn't the case when something was so simple and black and white. But the flip side of that is that information and data is also a really important lever for improvement. It's a powerful lever for change. And so we've constantly got this balance between wanting to publish something that changes behavior because policymakers want to guide the system. And one of the ways they guide the system is through the information they publish. But at the same time, we need to make sure that's done well. So in a way, policymakers need to think about 3 things when they're deciding what information they want. They need to think about what information they need to steer the system. They need to think about what information they need to monitor standards. And they need to think about what information they need in order to shift behavior. And so they have to take all 3 of those into account, and they can't think about them in isolation. So ultimately, what I've tried to argue today is that policymakers do need better information, whether it's more or better, we've discussed today, but they need that information in order to guide the system towards greater equity. And we underestimate the power of that information at our peril. So what we need to be doing is making sure we're capturing the experience of all young people, not just those at the average or at the threshold. We need to capture different dimensions of their experience, including the extent to which their basic needs are being met. We need to cast light on the opportunities that are available to them. And we need to be honest about the behavioural consequences of the information we gather and publish. So those are my sort of 4 takeaways from this really interesting discussion we had, and I'm really enjoying getting your perspectives on that as part of today too, which we'll now get to do as part of the Q&A that we're going to have now.
Yes, if anyone's got any comments or questions, you could put them just in the chat box, and we'll address them. Or if you'd like to come on and speak, then you can use the raise your hand icon, and then we can invite you to come on and talk.
Great.
Oh, it looks like we've got some hands up. Yeah, Jude, do you want to unmute and come to the floor?
Thank you. Really, it was just a reflection on the poll that you took and the questions that are being asked. So rather than do we need more data or more but better, I wonder whether the first question is, are we asking the right questions for the data that we are gathering? Because just to say we need better data doesn't actually question what it is that we are gathering. And I think a lot of what you've just been highlighting that needs to be looked at are in fact a lot of new questions. And so I think that there needed to be sort of a 4th button in there about, you know, are we asking the right question in the first place? But a very interesting meeting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that feedback. Obviously, I'm going to be writing up the discussion we had previously and today, so that I will make sure I draw on that in what I write. So thank you.
We've also got Joanna, who's got her hand up.
Thank you. I just want to raise a couple of points. One is around, I mean, we've been talking about data, but actually I think about it in terms of information, because there's three types of information or sources of information. One is around the quantitative data that we collect, which we can then analyze, do quantitative analysis. But I think the limits of that is that all it can do is tell you high-level differences and statistical information. But sometimes underneath that, it's to try and understand, so what's driving that, you still sometimes have to look at other sources to try and come up with the explanation, and that's either through more qualitative research or further surveys, or through intelligence gathering. So where I work, we have outreach workers, and we gather a lot of intelligence through just their engagement and what the issues are in different parts of the UK. So that's something about the different sources of information, which is more than just the data that we collect. For example, for us, it's around exams data and progression data. But I also just wanted to touch a little bit, just an example of how information about rankings. So I work in medical education and training, and we don't actually rank medical schools, but somewhere, as you say, there is information that means that people are choosing which medical schools they want to go to based on that. And there is one medical school which, for some reason, people want to go to, but yet it has a really low ranking. Which is because of the status and the brand of the university within which it sits, not necessarily the medical school itself. So it was just an example of how it affects behaviour.
Thank you. And yeah, one of the things I want to draw together when we have a next session about kind of the information practitioners look at is this sort of interface of some of the granular information you're able to get from your outreach workers and so on, and how that can then translate into a policy level, because they're different. There's a question of aggregation there and how that can translate.
We've also got Erin, who's got their hand up.
Yeah, I suppose I was reflecting on what you've been talking about employer data and looking at, future areas of work. And then when you mentioned about, I suppose, information that can be used for perverse ways and links to accountability measures, and actually how the two are quite interlinked. So I suppose I was thinking about, in terms of vocational pathways, and how we need to have them more integrated into schools, so that we do open up those pathways into jobs. And so we're not looking at making every learner fit into that sort of academic pathway, which might not even suit them, but also won't potentially suit the needs of employers in the future. And then it made me think about, I suppose, Scottish hires, which are used, that attainment data is used in a way to look at schools' rankings. And it's almost at odds with this idea of having an issue with parity of esteem for vocational qualifications, because on the one hand, you want to introduce more vocational qualifications and more sort of interlinkage, but at the same time, you have this accountability data that's almost providing a perverse incentive for schools not to do that. So it was just the potential loggerheads that was quite interesting to me.
Yeah. And are you based in Scotland, Erin?
I am. I work for the SQA.
Okay. Thanks.
Tim, Tim, would you like to speak?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it is really to do with this issue of purpose and levels of information. I think it's a couple of contributors have already raised this. If you're a minister sitting at a desk on the first morning in office, you want to know what you're dealing with in terms of the system, and what inequalities the system has embedded in it, and what you need to do to respond to them. So I think, Loic, one of the things that we discussed that evening, and I think which is all important, is being very, very clear about the purpose of a particular action and gathering a particular set of data. And people often overreach in terms of what they're interpreting from a certain body of data. I think it was really important the comment was made that to understand the mechanisms, what's actually going on, why ethnic Chinese kids achieve more than Bangladesh heritage children. To understand that, you can't just infer from the high-level national data that shows that there's a difference. And I think we've not got that right, actually. I think people, often without intending to, overreach in terms of the interpretation of the data that we collect. And I think to bring discipline to that through the kind of discussions you're stimulating is a really important matter.
Yeah.
We've also got quite a few comments in the chat. So Rebecca, Brooke, I don't know if there was anything particularly you wanted to pick out from those.
I think perhaps go to the next person with their hand up, because there's not so many questions coming out as much as comments reinforcing what everyone's already saying. So I think it's really important to read these.
Okay, great, sure.
Yeah,
okay, so
George.
Sorry, one thing I did want to pick up though, Penelope, was and there's a really interesting question here. It'd be great to hear what Loic thinks and the rest of the room actually. What do we do about time lag? So often the data that we get is 1-2 years old. Are there any ways that we can sort of improve the decision making on the basis of that being kind of old data, or how do we manage that situation?
Yeah, I think that's where some of the sort of novel data sets that I mentioned earlier on are starting to show their value and really did during the pandemic. And so firstly, we've during our dinner we talked partly about how attendance data could be improved. So the government is now looking to get much more rapid data gathering on a daily basis, so it has a dashboard of what's going on across the country in terms of young people's attendance to be able to pick up trends. So I think some of those, technology can help with things like that. Similarly, in the work I was doing, the research on the pandemic during at the height of it, I was using a lot of data that came from the Impact Ed platform, which is used in a lot of schools. That was giving some really regular updates on young people's well-being and how that interacted with different characteristics, so their background, the level of access they had to different facilities, and how that interacted. So that was actually providing a really useful source of information throughout in almost real time. Similarly with the teacher tap, that comes out every day, and they do things like repeat the same questions month on month, so that you can track trends, and that then obviously needs to be backed up by the qualitative work to say, okay, so why is that happening? So it's describing the trends which can then be explored further. So I think those are all examples of some of the ways some of this can be improved and the lags removed.
So that's an interesting as well, though, Loic. I do wonder, in terms of some of these fixes in there, is there more information still needed on the impact of the workload that might have on schools on a daily basis to suddenly have to provide information, quite readily, in addition to the work that they're also doing for attendance purposes? I think it's just yet another layer of information that still needs to be accounted for. So
I mean, the Holy Grail is combining both, isn't it? Because I think that at the moment schools are expected to fill in some quite onerous spreadsheets with things like attendance and so on, and that's why one of the spreadsheets we were told about has a 50% completion rate, and comes very late, whereas something like Teacher Tap is on someone's phone and there's a rapid check. So I think there's kind of some trade-offs there again, in terms of speed versus detail and accuracy.
Yeah, so the next person to hand up is George.
Thanks. Yes, I don't know if this will be the subject of a future session, but one of the things that is slightly concerning me listening to the discussions is that we don't seem to be discussing the sort of political aspect of data, that we're treating policymakers as being extremely neutral, and that if we just give them the right data, they will do what is in the best interests, or what they claim to be in the best interests of people. But we know, for example, that there is a huge correlation between child poverty and child educational attainment, and we also know that reducing the benefit universal credit is going to throw more children into poverty, and yet here we are. And so what I'm kind of interested in is, like, having more data and better data is great, but also I think we need to be wary of treating policymakers as though they're necessarily going to act in the best interests of the society or children or anybody else, rather than in the interests of the groups they actually represent. And so I don't know if this is going to be the subject of a future session, but I thought it was worth raising the kind of political aspect of data here as well.
Yeah, and I guess that links to who's using the data, right? Because I think that certainly if I've spent years trying to talking to the government about things like child poverty and how it relates to education and so on, and some of the data that's out there may not be being looked at or taken into account as it should be by a policymaker, but it makes it much easier for people like me to make the case when we have that data. One of the things Rachel D'Souza was saying was how having the data from a big ask has made it much easier when she's trying to influence the priorities of a new Secretary of State, particularly given he comes from a background as a pollster, therefore having a 500,000 sample of young people and being able to show some of these trends makes it much easier to lobby and have that influence. So I guess it's politics is a battleground, and it's a case of different people trying to make cases, but having that data means that you're not just another person with an opinion. You can point to some concrete things.
There's a couple of questions in the chat as well to do with reliability of data, and Sylvia's mentioned, should we be looking more actively for conflicting data? We like consistency and an easy narrative, but this reinforces the idea that things are simple.
Yeah.
So we could go to Theodora now.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something relating to reliability, which is that, well, when we're talking about all of the things that we've talked about, like especially availability of opportunities, which I think is a very important topic, I think we also need to focus on barriers to that availability, because the opportunities might be there, but there may be barriers that we don't have enough data on, and we don't necessarily, and we can't necessarily get an understanding from quantitative data. So one thing that I like to do when I have the opportunity to do it is go out and talk to organizations who deal with various marginalized groups. So if we're talking about accessibility, for example, talk to organizations who deal with various accessibility needs, so people with various impairments, and that brings about what you were talking about earlier, which is the conflicting needs, because accessibility, especially in terms of accessibility, but in general in terms of inclusion of marginalized groups, you end up with conflicting needs. And it's really hard to balance out what exactly we need to do or what policymakers would need to do in between, but because from a quantitative perspective, you will have the, the vast majority of able, neurotypical, middle class people who are doing fine. And that's the average that we're talking about. So yeah, I'm wondering what kind of data we can gather on that reflect on those barriers.
Yeah. And I think that, as you say, links back to that first point about what's going on at every point in the distribution and for the subgroups within that. And often, as you say, that will reveal contradictions and tensions. But you miss that if you're only looking at the average and only looking at the threshold.
Okay, we could move to Sharon.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Sharon.
Right, my point is about disability. I'm disabled. The students have disabled rights. Do teachers have disabled rights to become a good role model for their students? I'm questioning whether that's the case because you're earmarked as somebody that might be a waste of space, and I'm just been through the system and I've done well in the system, and you want your students to be doing well too. So that's what my question is. I get what George says is a political decision to support disabled students. Where is the decision to support the disabled teachers? Because there's policies in place in different sort of authorities, but how much of that is actually backed up? That's my situation. I don't want to put my camera on. I'm sorry, but I prefer not to be seen. I just want to be talking to you, if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine. And yeah, as we said, no pressure for anyone to have their camera on if they don't want to. And yeah, I think thank you for that point, because actually we've talked a lot about information on children and young people going through the education system, but a hugely important part of that, all the things we've said about children and young people and not looking just at the average there, apply equally to the workforce and understanding different teachers' experiences and everyone working in the education sector. And how that's impacting on them, and again tying into this question of if we're not aware of the disabled young people, disabled teachers, and those with special educational needs, and try and expect always the same threshold and only care about the same threshold, then we're not necessarily taking into account what allows everyone to flourish. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn now to I think it's Brooke. Are you going to say a few words, or Penelope, to close us, and I will say a little bit just after that about what we're doing in our next session.
I'm going to hand over to Brooke.
Cool.
Oh, Penelope, you've caught me off guard. I thought that you were going to round it up. No, I think really that the main point is I know Loic is obviously this is the second one of our seminars or webinars on this, and I must admit I think what I've really enjoyed today is hearing and seeing all of you. So thank you so much for that. Even just the small breakout session I had felt really great to hear everyone's input. And I think obviously I don't want to steal what Loic's about to say, where he's going to be taking this further. So I just wanted to thank you so much for signing up for this, and just keep an eye out for all of the other things that the Cambridge Assessment Network will be putting out in the near future.
Great, thank you. Okay, so yeah, so I've alluded a few times to what would be to the kind of plan of action going forwards. But obviously today we've been focusing at this sort of high level policymaker focus, but at times we've touched on what does this mean at a practitioner level. And as Tim said, part of the question with information is what's it being used for, the different purposes, and what is suitable for what use. So in our next session, we're going to be looking at similar questions around information, but from a practitioner perspective, and we'll be able to pull out some of the differences there in terms of the purposes and uses for practitioners versus policymakers. So that's going to be our session next time. We're going to be having presenting some themes there, and then following on from that, the next one will be looking at the sort of information sharing, so how we join together the information from different sources. So we're already starting to touch on some of those themes today, but we'll be building on that. After each session, I'll be writing a piece that brings together the thoughts. So watch out, as Brooke said, for the blogs and social media around those coming out, and I will try and represent not just those who've spoken today, but also those in the chat, and so that everyone's views are drawn on, and because we really appreciate the fact that this is a conversation and that you've all been feeding really valuable insights into that. So thank you again for participating in that.
Yeah, thank you for everyone that came and participated, and yeah, just as Loic says, keep an eye out for what's coming next.
Great. Thanks all.